Hello everyone. I'm doing another Magic the Gathering deck tech video. Today is a deck for Azori's Blink. I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint still, but I'm kind of hoping that my audio is better. If it's too loud, I'll just redo this whole thing maybe, or just turn down the volume or something. I'll figure it out. But so I'll just get right into the deck. So it's a budget deck. So it's about $31, just about. You'll see later in the video at the end, at least the budget, and I'll have the deck list down below so you guys can get this for yourself. So I'm going to start off with the commanders. So you do have your commander. Oh, I probably don't even really need my mouse there. You've got Abdel, Adrian, Gorion's Ward, and Candlekeep Sage. The background says basically when your commander enters or leaves the battlefield, you draw a card, and your commander exiles any number of non-land permanents you control until he leaves, and you create a 1/1 soldier for each permanent exiled this way. So the idea is really we don't care too much about the soldiers, but we want to exile as many non-land permanents as we can, and then when he leaves, he comes back, and or they all come back, and we get another effect. So if we blink him, we get to do those bonuses. We get to draw 2 cards, and we get to the effects of all the ETBs, and we get a bunch of 1/1 soldiers as well. So it's a really good card. Like, it's actually probably just one of the best cards for this kind of strategy, as you'll see in a second. First, we're going to try to blink him. So these are Cloud Shift and Essence Flux do about the same thing. I don't really think we have any spirits, if I remember. We'll see in a second. But exiled creature returned back to the battlefield, and we in Flicker of Fate does the same, but it can do a creature or enchantment, but it is 1 more mana. And as you'll see, we kind of want to get lower mana cost, but it does get up to 4 cost for the same effect, just about. But a lot of the 1 and 2 mana here is really good and effective, and they're both instants because we do need these all to be instant. Well, most of these effects are usually instant anyways, so it wasn't too much of a hinder to the deck process to get the instance of these. Blink. So we're going to do it again. We pretty much have 15 of these. Justicar's Portal blinks the creature, but it gets first strike. So you're exiling it, returning back to the battlefield, and it gets first strike when it enters back. Momentary Blink is the same thing, but it can be it doesn't get first strike like Portal, but you can flash it back for 4 mana, though usually you only want to do that in an emergency if you really need to, because you can't get it back with some of the other cards you'll see later on. And then Planar Incursion exiles a creature, and then you get it back with a +1/+1 counter on it. You can also do anyone's artifact or creature, and there are some artifacts in here. There's one that your opponent can actually gain control of, but you could use this to get it back and get the enter the battlefield effect of it as well, even if it is under an opponent's control. So you can actually use this on someone's token if you really need to use it as a removal spell. Siren's Ruse, exile a creature, and then if it's a return back to the battlefield. If it's a pirate, you draw a card. We do have a couple pirates. It's actually not true. I was about to say last minute inclusions later on you'll see were pirates. But for the most part, you're just going to use this on your commander. But if you do use it on a pirate, you do get to draw a card, so it's actually not too terrible. The Ring tempts you. It's exile a target creature, return to the battlefield. The Ring tempts you. So you really aren't going to use this mechanic too often. You can pretty easily, if you go infinite with it, go all the way with the ring mechanic, but the ring tempts you doesn't really matter, to be honest. Like, it's not really going to come up that often. If you want to keep track of it, you can. I'm probably not going to when I play the deck. Acrobatic Maneuver. So we're getting the first 3 mana one effect, and a lot of these either they exile 2 creatures or they draw you a card. So this one draws you a card after you exile the creature and then return it back to the battlefield. Blur is the same thing, but blue. Exile a target creature, return to the battlefield, draw a card. Displace does the 2 creatures, then return to the battlefield under their owner's control. So what's it called? These and Ghostly Flicker is the same, but you can do lands and artifacts you control. For the most part, these are pretty much the same thing. You usually only really care about flickering 1. You can do a land with Ghostly Flicker if you really have to, because it isn't up to, it's actually required to have another one. So a lot of times you just do an untapped land and produce a mana from it. So a lot of times Ghostly Flicker could be more like 1 mana or 2 mana, whereas Displace does 2 creatures, which can be nice if you want to get it to enter the battlefield effect again, and then also get the creature onto your field. And then we'll go to the last three. Release of the Wind is more like a sorcery because you exile the non-land permanent, which would be your commander, and you get to cast it for as long as it remains exiled without paying its mana cost. So you exile your commander, and you get to cast it again. So it doesn't enter and leave. You exile it, then you cast it again. So it's a little different because you can't use this to respond to someone else's you can use it to respond to a removal spell, but you can't just like go through the combo again if someone has. I guess it's not as bad. It's just you can't bury something on the stack with this because all these other effects. If you did have a creature that returns these back to your hand, you could bury it on the stack. But this one, the whole stack has to resolve. Then you reintroduce this card onto the stack, and I'll show you the combo in a bit. Scroll Shift is the same as Blur earlier, but it can do a creature, artifact, or enchantment, and you draw a card. Illusionist Stratagem is kind of weird, but it's a 4 mana, exile 2 creatures, and then you draw a card. So it's basically Displace, but you draw a card, and it's 1 more mana. And then we have Blink. This is the last Blink stuff, and I'll explain what we're blinking because right now we're just getting to the point of generating value by making our commander enter and leave the battlefield to draw a card and draw another card. So with both of these creatures, they actually can go infinite on their own if we use one of the Blink effects from before or another Blink effect, because if we get Feldar Guardian underneath our commander, then, when our commander leaves the battlefield and enters again, Felidar Guardian can exile our commander, return him back to the battlefield, and then our commander will exile him. So, before the ability of Feldar Guardian resolves, have your commander exile Feldar Guardian. Then, when Feldar Guardian blinks your commander through its effect, since it won't be taken out by the stack or whatever, you just basically get to blink them both over and over and over again. So you can actually do the same thing with a Restoration Angel because your commander's not an angel. There is another card similar to this, but it says non-warrior, and our commander is a warrior. And I think they did that on purpose because both our commander and that card came in the same set. So they're trying to avoid something like just an infinite combo at a pre-release, which makes sense. Card draw. These are all just 2 mana creatures that enter the battlefield and draw a card. Flibblethip becomes the target of a spell. You put it into its owner's library, so you don't want to flicker this with any of your spell effects. But if it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and if it entered from your library, you draw 2. But that doesn't matter since we don't have any effects that I'm aware of. We don't have any effects that do that. Spirited Companion, 2 mana, draw a card. Wall of Omens, a 2 mana 0/4 that draws a card and has Defender, so it can't attack. You don't really want to attack with this deck. Watcher of Tomorrow, you get to look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile one of them underneath him, and then when he leaves the battlefield, you put that card into your hand. You want to make sure that you do the Hideaway trigger first before you exile him and make him leave, because otherwise you don't get the card that he exiled. So you need the Hideaway trigger to resolve first. But if it doesn't resolve first and you're not going to get the card, you at least know ahead, so you can just exile a land if you happen to come across one of those. Inspiring Overseer and Priest of Ancient Lore are the same card, but a little bit different. So, Priest of Ancient Lore, 3 mana, 2/1, draw a card, and gain a life. Inspiring Overseer is the same thing, exactly the same, and they're both commons for some reason. But Inspiring Overseer has flying. It's the only difference, and it's kind of just a weird power creep thing. Now we're going on to card draw. More card draw. The whole deck's about drawing cards. We're trying to combo off, but Elite Guard Mage enters the battlefield, draw a card, gain 3 life for 4 mana. It's pretty decent, and it has flying. Combat Thresher is a new interesting card that I didn't think about when I first started making the deck, but after I started getting towards the finishing touches, I realized that this card's actually really great. You can 3 mana prototype it in, which means you get a 3 mana 1/1 with double strike, and it enters the battlefield and you draw a card. But if you exile it and return it back to the battlefield, it will become a 3/3 with double strike and it'll draw you a card. but you can cast it for 3 mana or 7 mana. Usually you're just going to cast it for 3 mana because there's a million ways to flicker it. And then we're going to get to this is probably the first non-creature, non-land permanent in the deck. So we got Ichor Wellspring, enters the battlefield or is put into the graveyard, draw a card. If someone does destroy it, or like destroy all artifacts, you will get a card out of it, and it's not too bad to lose this card. This one's just more of just an extra card draw. Prophetic Prism, enters the battlefield, you draw a card, but you can tap 1 mana, add 1 mana of any color. This is great if you're if you're starting to blink over and over again and you want the certain color of mana. This will actually cycle through the mana colors for you. We got Spare Supplies. It enters the battlefield tapped, but you can when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can pay 2 mana to sacrifice to draw a card. This is good if you're missing land drops, if you really are desperate, or if you can always just use this to draw more cards when you flicker your commander. More card draw. So Confounding Conundrum, we're just using it for the card draw effect, but it does disrupt people from ramping, because whenever they have a land enter the battlefield, whenever your opponent has a land that enters the battlefield and they already had a land enter the battlefield that turn, they have to return a land to their owner's hand. So if they're playing fetch lands, they have to wait a turn to fetch it, or they're going to have to fetch it on your turn. And then Omen of the Seas is 2 mana, scry 2, draw a card, and you can play it at an instant speed, like an instant spell. You can pay 3 mana, sacrifice it, scry 2. Usually the scrying isn't that important. You'll have so many cards that you'll have something to do with the mana. And then now we're going on to Recursion. So this is what we're doing with all the Blink instants and sorceries, or just instants, because we don't have any sorceries in this deck. Archaeomancer, these are all going to be just about the same, so I'm just going to go through them real quick. Returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand for a 4 mana 1/2. It's usually okay, it's not that great. When you're flickering it to get back the blink spell, then blinking your commander, all you need is mana, and you can generate infinite mana and draw your whole deck. And usually you can do something else and kind of win off of that. Wall's the same thing, but it's a 0/4 defender for 4 mana, or for 5 mana, sorry. Salvager of Secrets gets 1 more toughness, but it costs 1 more than Archaeomancer. So they're pretty much all the same. We're just using these to blink them to return the spells that blinked our commander with them. So usually want to get these underneath our commander, then blink our commander over and over again for free value. Even if we don't get infinite mana or anything like that from looping these, you can usually at least get enough an advantage that you can block your opponents from killing you until your card draw eventually overwhelms them. Recursion, these are the same things, but I don't remember what this guy's name is. Scrivener? It's a weird name, but you return an instant card from your graveyard to your hand. It's really not that good, because you only get instants, but in this deck, it pretty much is another combo piece. Shipwreck Dowser is actually it's actually a 3/3 with prowess, so whenever you do cast those blink spells, it will get +1/+1, and it returns the instant and sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. This is very good. It's just basically the same thing. We're just trying to get those cards back so we can keep blinking over and over again. The Mirari Conjecture, it says return target instant on the first chapter, and when we blink it back into play, it'll get that instant back. We really don't care about 2, and we don't really need 3, so I would only ever go for the first effect. You can blink it, and if it does take a turn for you to get your blink effect out or get your commander out, to use Mirari Conjecture again, then you just wait the turn. You usually don't want to get this to the 3rd chapter, but if you do get to the 3rd chapter, sometimes that's good enough just to at least get enough value. So it's not a terrible thing. You're never going to get any value from number 2. Okay, and then we got Reanimator. So this is where we're going to reanimate things like creatures or non-creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield. So Karmic Guide, it's at the beginning of your upkeep. If it came into play since the last upkeep, sacrifice it unless you pay 5. But if you exile it with your commander and keep blinking it, you can usually get every creature back from your graveyard. It has flying and protection from black. And I did say we didn't have spirits. I kind of forgot this one, just a spirit for some reason. Doesn't really matter though. You usually don't care about it, and you can blink it so it gets around the echo cost if you need to. But it returns a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield when it enters. That's the main point of what we are looking here for. And then Sun Titan, when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you return a permanent with value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. We have a lot of fetch lands, so we can get those back and make land drops. or we can get creatures and non-creatures back that we either sacrificed or used to block or got removed. And very good value there. Like sometimes if you go through the loop, you can get every instant or basic land out of your deck with Sun Titan. It is 6 mana though, but it's pretty good. Removal. So how these work, so Oblivion Ring and Detention Spear are pretty much the same card in a way. When Detention Spear enters the battlefield, you exile non-land permanent named not named Detention Spear and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent. And when it leaves the battlefield, you return that permanent into play under its owner's control. So what ends up happening with Oblivion Ring and Detention Spear is that you can exile a someone's creature, right? And then you target the exile effect, and then you put that on the stack before Gorion's trigger. So when Gorion leaves, the permanent will then get, or when Gorion enters the battlefield and exiles Detention Spear, it'll leave the battlefield before anything gets exiled, so that trigger will go off. But then it'll exile the permanent, and then it will not see the Detention Sphere be there. So you basically, it's kind of confusing, but the best way to put it is if you put the trigger on the stack first, it'll resolve last to exile the permanent. Then when it leaves, it'll leave before that permanent gets exiled, so it'll never see the permanent in the exile zone to come back. So they'll never get that permanent back is basically the best way to put it. And these are all non-land permanents. It's your best removal. Sometimes you can just use it as a 3-mana removal, and it's fine. And usually if you blink it, you can get rid of all your opponent's non-land permanents, and usually that's good enough to at least solidify the board. Reality Acid is kind of an interesting one. When it leaves the battlefield, enchanted permanent. So you enchant a permanent. You can do lands as well. It has Vanishing 3, so after 3 turns, you sacrifice it. But you can get it back with Sun Titan, and when it leaves the battlefield, enchanted permanent sacrifices it. So even though you enchant your opponent's permanent, you still own the aura, which is Reality Acid. And then when you exile Reality Acid and bring it back to the battlefield, it'll make the person sacrifice that permanent, and then you enchant something else to remove. And if you go through the loop here, you can pretty much make them sacrifice all their lands, everything that doesn't have hexproof or shroud, and they will usually concede on the spot there. It's usually just an easy, I win the game because you can't anymore. Here's some more disruption. Aether Channeler actually is a very awesome card for this deck because you get 3 modes. You can make a bird with flying. You can return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Usually this will be your opponent's. You could do yourself, it is possible, but usually you'd want to do your opponent's. Or you draw a card. And for 3 mana, this is an amazing effect. Sometimes you draw the card. You can make a bird for blockers. And if you do get O Infinite, you can return all non-land permanents your opponents control back to their hand, so they have to recast them. Usually setting them back at least a few turns, maybe even just one at the very least, like at least 1 turn. Mage's Attendant, if you can infinitely blink this, or even just blink it a bunch, you can keep countering your opponent's spells that are non-creatures unless they pay 1. So what ends up happening is you blink this a bunch, and then your opponents start to not be able to remove your commander or use counter spells against your spells because there's so many 1/1 blue wizard tokens. So these do make tokens, but your main point is really just the 1/1 blue wizard that can pay 1 to sacrifice it. Then you have Stonehorn Dignitary. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent skips his or her next combat step or phase. So this is good against regressive decks. You can usually just use this to completely stop your opponent from going through their next combat phase. Like they just get stonewalled out. Stonehorn Dignitary, I guess, in a way. But they just can't attack you, and if you blink this multiple times, you can do each of your opponents, so they have no way to interact with you. It's a just great card for 4 mana, honestly. And then we've got Ramp. So this is just going to be a bunch of stuff that either enters the battlefield and gets you a land, or things that if you combo off, you can usually use these to tap for mana. So we've got Solemn Simulacrum. When he enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land, you put it on the battlefield tapped. So just basically like a rampant growth. But when he dies, you draw a card. For the most part, he's just a good ramp, and then if you do get to blink him, you start to draw more cards. And if he gets removed, you draw a card. But when he enters, instead of drawing cards earlier, sorry, I meant that you get lands and you can ramp, which helps you a lot more when you're trying to combo off because you'll always have cards in hand no matter what. If you don't have cards in hand, someone did something to make you not have cards in hand. This deck draws and draws and draws, or you just didn't. Yeah, there's no way you don't. Um, Springleaf Drum, you can pay 1 mana, tap this, and tap an untapped creature you control to make a mana. So this actually does go infinite because if you keep tapping your commander when he enters before you blink him again, he can blink. He can exile Springleaf Drum to come in untapped, which then untaps Springleaf Drum when it comes back in, or any of your mana artifacts. And then you can keep using this mana to then use your blink effect if you have a way to recur the spell. Azorius Signet is just 2 mana. Tap it for 2 mana if you pay 1 mana. So you basically make 1 mana through it. So you need a mana as well. But once you get the first mana, if you have like a 1 mana blink spell, sometimes you can just use 1 of the white or 1 of the blue to pay for the next one. As long as you do that right, you should be able to infinite with this and one of the 1-drop blink effects. Ramp, Prismatic Lens is an example of, well, I'll go Fellwar Stone, 1 mana of what your opponents has. So as long as they have blue or white, you usually can make one of those mana. A lot of people are playing white because it has been getting better, and blue is a very powerful color in Commander. Prismatic Lens, you can use it to filter your mana, but it also makes it colorless. Usually you would just use this in addition to some of the other lands, but if you do get to blink it enough, for the most part, this is just if you have a Soul Ring and you're blinking off with this, you can then get the 3rd mana, because a lot of the blink effects are, at least they're only 1 blue or 1 white, and then 2 or 1 or whatever. They're usually they're not 2 white and 1, they're not 2 blue and 1, they're just blue and then 2, or blue and 1, or blue. So this usually is if you have Soul Ring, you can combo off with this and Soul Ring if you have infinite blinks, but for the most part it's just a 2 mana rock just to help you ramp. Commander Sphere, it just makes your mana's color identity, and if someone does remove all artifacts and enchantments, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. And then Coveted Jewel. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, and you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color. And then whenever an opponent attacks you, and if it isn't blocked, that player draws 3 cards, gains control of Coveted Jewel, and untaps it. So you cannot blink it once it becomes under someone else's control. But if you have if you can play this, then your commander, then exile this underneath your commander is usually the way you would want to go. It does require 8 mana, but it is very much worth it. You can usually ramp out pretty well with this deck, or at least put up some sort of barrier between you and the opponent. Disruption. These cards are actually really good. So I think I put these in the wrong space, but that's okay. When Venser enters the battlefield, you return a spell or permanent to its owner's hand. This is a great counter spell in this deck, and it's also a really good way to just win the game. If you go through infinite loops of blinking everything, Venser will actually eventually bounce all your opponent's lands and everything else on the field to their hand. It's very much like Reality Acid, except it goes back to their hand. Ixodron is an interesting card because I didn't consider it when I first started making this deck, but afterwards I started to realize how powerful this is. When it enters the battlefield, or actually it's not when, because this is a very good reason why they're different, but it's as it enters the battlefield, turn all other non-token creatures face up. So what ends up happening is this effect goes off before any of your creatures enter. So then what ends up happening is they flip upside down, and then they lose all of their abilities. So basically, all your stuff, if it blinks with your commander, Ixodron's fine with that. And even if your commander does leave, its effect is still inactive, so you could play this after your commander and be fine because your commander's effect will still work. So you'll be able to exile your creatures and return them back. It's really good disruption. It turns all their creatures into 2/2s. A lot of times people have a lot of synergy with their creatures, their commanders especially. You just turn them into 2/2s, and he becomes a whatever equal to the number of 2/2s on the battlefield. Oops, sorry. We'll go to the next one. These are temporary ramp, but these were the pirates I was talking about earlier. Sailor of Mean is 3 mana for a 1/4 that makes a treasure when it enters the battlefield, and Prosperer Pirates are 3/4s that or 5 mana 3/4s that make 2 treasures when they enter. So the idea is the treasures can sacrifice for 1 mana, and if you're going through the loop, these keep entering the battlefield, making more treasures to then pay for the blink effects. If we had more things that return instants and sorceries, we'd probably be doing a lot better. But we only really have the 6 effects that I know of that aren't insanely expensive mana cost wise, that they wouldn't just be worth playing a more fair game in the long haul. Like you would have to end up going to a longer turn just to be able to play the 7 mana blinks anyways. Um, there are more treasures, so we have a lot of quick ways to ramp. Gilded Pinions is makes a it can give it it's an equipment that enters the battlefield and creates a treasure. An equipped creature has flying, and it's 2 to equip. We really don't care that's an equipment. We just want it 2 mana, enters the battlefield, make a treasure. Prize Statue, 2 mana artifact enters the battlefield or leaves or is put into the graveyard, you create a treasure. So for the most part, we just care about them entering the battlefield, making treasures. So it's our 4 ways to make treasures for the most part. And then we have Untap Lands. These are much like our treasures in a sense, but they're much more temporary. We can make infinite treasures and keep them to the next turn. If we use Cloud Fairies or Drake, they go away. We have to use that mana until our next untap step. So when Fairies enters, it untaps 2 lands, and it's a 2 mana 2 mana 1/1 with flying, and it has it untaps the lands. It has cycling for 2 mana. We don't care about cycling. We are probably never going to use that. We really would want the Cloud Fairies no matter what. Drake enters, it's 5 mana, untaps 5 lands when it enters. Usually these are pretty free to play. You could play Drake, then play your commander right after if you have it in hand. So Cloud Fairies, you can usually play this for 2 mana, and then we have a bunch of 2 mana creatures or anything else that you can play afterwards. And then when you do go off with your commander, it does untap 2 lands, and we do have lands that actually untap for 2 mana, as you'll see later on in the video. This is probably the last non-land card if I remember, but it is cheating, kind of. Cheating with mana. But you manifest a card from your hand, so you put it as a face down 2/2, and then you turn it face up for its mana cost at any time. But the main point is if you exile a card that you manifest, so you basically you just put the card onto the field upside down so no one sees it, or face down, and then when you it's a 2/2. But when you exile it and return it back to the battlefield with your commander, you can flip it face up. Because it'll exile face up and then come back up as its regular self, getting the ETB effect usually. You can use this usually just to empty your hand while you're like ramping, and you can usually just like no matter what it is, even if it isn't a creature, you can manifest it. So you can manifest anything. It can be a land, it can be everything but instances like your instance, essentially. You put them down as 2/2 creatures and you can flip them up. So you usually just want to use this if you're going through your loop, just to go through your deck. It actually would, because you're going to be drawing cards if you have your other commander. And this is also a good point where before I get too far, if you have your background and you're about to and you're worried about decking yourself out, you can exile your background with your commander and choose to put it in the command zone instead of exile, which will then leave it in your command zone. It'll cost 2 more to cast, but you won't draw your whole deck, which is usually what most people hope when you're doing this deck. So usually if you're comboing with your commander, you want to get as many card draw as you can and get maybe 10 cards to the left in your library, then get rid of your what is it called? Your enchantment, and then not exile anything else that card draws unless you really do need that last 10 cards. Enough said, these are all commander staples. Soul Ring, 1 mana, tap for 2, colorless. Arcane Signet, 2 mana, tap for 1 color of any color in your commander's identity. Command Tower is the same thing. Tap it for any color in your commander's identity. These are just staples, but Soul Ring actually was a good chunk of the cost of this deck. It was like $1.50 just about. Okay. Lands, these all fetch for other lands. Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic, sacrifice it, search for a basic, put on the battlefield tapped. Myriad Landscape enters the battlefield tapped, but you can use it to use a colorless, and when you have enough mana, you can tap it to search for 2 basics of the same type and put them on the battlefield tapped. So this will actually ramp you 1 mana if you need it. Sometimes you just usually don't, but it is good to have it. Lands, we have a gate, just Azorius Gate, taps for blue and a white. And then we have Broker's Hideout and Obscura Storefront. They can both search for 3 land types, but they both search for plains and an island, which is the main thing. You usually use them. They enter the battlefield, they sacrifice, they search for an island, and you gain a life. So you do gain a life through this. And if you get Sun Titan out, you can gain infinite life if you don't have any basic lands, because you still do get the 1 life no matter what. These are all just tap lands, except they both have plains and island subtype. It doesn't really matter, but Prairie Stream does have it, so it enters untapped if you have 2 or more basic lands. So usually you will, because we have a bunch of fetch lands and a bunch of basics. You'll see in a second. Azorius Chancery was the land that taps for 2 mana that I was talking about. It enters tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a land to your hand, but it taps for a blue and a white. So if you have any ways to untap this land, you usually end up ramping through it if you have Polygram Drake or the fairies. We have Temple of Enlightenment, and it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. So you look at the top card of your library. If you don't like it, put it on the bottom. Otherwise, you keep it on top. And then Tranquil Cove, it enters the battlefield tapped, but you gain a life. Essentially, it's like the fetch lands earlier, but it just enters the battlefield, you don't search your library at all. Exotic Orchard taps for 1 mana of any color your opponent can produce. So usually you're doing this just to get mana. I mean, it's just usually they'll have blue or white, and if not, it's colorless. That's the worst case scenario. But I think you usually will get 1 person with blue and 1 person with white, at least in the Commander game. Port Town, it enters untapped if you reveal an island or a plains from your hand. Earlier, I showed those 3 cards that had islands and plains. You can show those, or a basic land. Sky Cloud Expanse is just it's like Azorius Signet. It's 1 mana, tap it, then you make 2 mana. Usually this is the same amount. You're just making 1 mana from it, but it does filter your mana, so you can use colorless mana and then turn it into colored mana if you need to. Path of Ancestry. Essentially, if you cast a human or a warrior spell with this with Path of Ancestry's mana, you scry 1. Look at the top card. Don't like it, put on the bottom. And then it produces 1 mana of any color of our commander's identity. Razor Tide Bridge is an indestructible land in case anyone is running any land destruction. It really doesn't come up, but it's mostly just because it taps for a blue or a white. Sky Bridge Towers taps for blue or white, but it's 4 mana to sacrifice it to draw a card. We don't ever need to do that. It's just tapping for blue and a white. It's cheap. And then we're to our basic lands. So we have 8 plains and 9 islands. We have a lot of blue effects in this deck for sure. Like a lot of the effects in this deck are double blue, and there's a few double white, but there's more double blue. And a lot of our return cards are blue. A lot of our blink effects are blue. There's a lot of blue in the deck, but there's still a good amount of white, obviously. I would say we're pretty close to even on that front. And this is the budget. It's $31.18. It's actually more expensive on MTGO for some reason. I don't even know if you can get every card from here on MTGO, but for the most part, this is just blue-white budget, which is the same thing as Azorius. Azorius is what the Signet was called, and that's what the combination of colors in Magic, blue and white, are. It's a pretty fun deck. I've play tested it a lot. I haven't play tested it in groups yet. I know that's not exactly the best thing, but I at least know the deck functions well. Even if it does get disrupted, a lot of the things that they would disrupt are usually fine, because as long as they resolve. If they remove it, it's not as bad for you, because if your commander comes in, gets removed, you get all those cards back, and then you get to do it again once your commander comes back. So they have to do something that would just destroy you in general. And for $31, this is a pretty strong deck, honestly. I enjoyed making it. I hope you guys. I might even do a video of me trying it out on Spell Table. So just let me know. I'll have the deck list down below, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Have a good one. Bye.